We spent the first week of the quarter kind of going over a history and a timeline of when Daniel took place and kind of the things and events surrounding the book and events of Daniel so that we could get a picture of when and how things were kind of going down at that time. Last week we went through chapter 1, and chapter 1 was how Daniel separated and dedicated himself to God in the midst of everything he'd gone through. Remember, Jerusalem and the nation of Judah had been overthrown by Nebuchadnezzar, just like Jeremiah had talked about. Everything Jeremiah said had come true. Nebuchadnezzar was given free rein by God to go through and destroy nation after nation, including Judah, as a way of punishing them, and Nebuchadnezzar took the best and the brightest back to his own place. And he did everything to convert the exiles into good Chaldeans, good Babylonians that he could. He gave them their schooling and their new names and their new culture, their new identities, and a new diet. And that's where Daniel chose to separate himself from everyone else. In doing so, he gave God the credit for who he would become instead of Nebuchadnezzar. And he said, I'm here, I'm working for you, Nebuchadnezzar, but ultimately I hope you know my true allegiance is to the God that I serve. And he really separated him out that way, and God rewarded it because he made Daniel super successful. The end of the chapter says he was 10 times better than any of the other students that were there at the academy with him, Babylon Academy. Babylon University? Maybe. BU? Anyway, 10 times better than all the other students there at his studies. And so he continued to remain dedicated to God. And that's where we pick up Daniel chapter 2. If you have your Bible, go ahead and look at verse 1 of Daniel chapter 2. And it says this: In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. It's a little early in the chapter to pause maybe, but I think we're going to pause anyway. Think about that. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And as I try to picture the timeline, and I look back at chapter 1, here's what I see. Look at chapter 1, verse 5. Daniel is brought to Babylon pretty much at the same time that Nebuchadnezzar was made king. You remember Nebuchadnezzar kind of hears that his father died as he's overthrowing Jerusalem, so he pulls out the best to take with him, and he hightails it back to Babylon to be crowned king. The exiles show up, maybe a little behind him or whatever, but basically at the same time. So he puts them into school about at the same time he's becoming king. And these guys were in training in school for 3 years, right? Which means they would be done with their training by the end, at about the time of Nebuchadnezzar's, what? 3rd year, roughly. Chapter 2, verse 1. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Where was Daniel at this point? Well, like anything else, commentators disagree just a little bit. They say, well, if you start counting Nebuchadnezzar's year here, and it doesn't go to there, and it wasn't a full year, and this and that, and kind of finagling around. They say, well, maybe Daniel had just completed his training. I'm not so sure. I wonder if maybe he wasn't still in school at this time. There's a couple reasons later in the chapter, or at least one reason why I kind of maybe think that. I don't know for sure. Maybe he was just graduated. Maybe he was still in school. But the point is, he was really young still. And if he was taken in his mid to late teens, maybe like a lot of people think, he was probably a late teenager, maybe early 20s, but probably in his mid to late teens at this point in chapter 2. So keep that in mind. So this picture that we oftentimes think of, or at least I thought of at this time, Daniel has this dream and he kind of walks up with his cane and he's the elderly advisor that's been trusted for years. That's really not quite accurate. It probably looks more like this, doesn't it? Here's this wet behind the ears, greenhorn, wise guy that's still in school or maybe just graduated out of school. And Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. So let's continue reading here. Chapter 2, verse 1. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who, by the way, is himself just a new king, still trying to establish himself. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So the king calls in all of his advisors, you astrologers, you sorcerers, you communicators with the dead. If you have any kind of special insights or any special powers, or you're just an all-around smart guy, all of my group of advisors, he brings them all in, because this is really bothering him. And in verse 2, so they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. And I don't know if this is a new, unique event for the advisors or if this had happened before or whatever. But verse 4, then the Chaldeans, who are apparently speaking for the whole group, said to the king in Aramaic. And by the way, just pause. We said in the first week that part of the book is in Hebrew, part is in Aramaic. This is where it switches over. So mentally, from here on through chapter 7, we're now not just speaking to the Jewish people. Now we're broadcasting to the entire Babylonian nation. Okay, so switch your mindset a little bit into a Babylonian resident. Okay? Here's what you read. Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. All right, king, we are here to serve you. We are the smartest. We are the most wise. You adore us because we are smart. We give you advice. You had a dream. You're troubled by it. All you have to do is tell us the dream, O king, and we will exude our brilliance and tell you what the dream is. Question. Were these guys legitimate psychics, what we might call them? Were they legitimate or were they phony? What do you think? It's hard to say for sure. I suspect some of them were phony, and apparently from what we read later in chapter 2, I think Nebuchadnezzar thought maybe the same thing. But they say, all right, king, we will show you how brilliant we are. You tell us the dream, we'll tell you what it means. Easy, right? Verse 5, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. In other words, I have made up my mind. I'm not kidding about this. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your house shall be laid in ruins. The king gives a fun little twist here, doesn't he? Here's how the conversation goes. The king says, tell me my dream. Wise men say, okay, what is the dream? King says, tell me my dream and the interpretation. And the wise men say, okay, what is the dream? This almost reminds me of back in Pharaoh's time, back in Genesis chapter 41. You remember Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he has a dream, and he can't find anybody that can interpret for him, and he goes to everybody and says, I've had a dream, and here's what it is, right? There's cows, they're really fat cows, and they're coming up out of the river, and they're eating on the corn, and they're all big and huge. And then there's 7 skinny cows, and they're coming up out of the river, and their ribs are showing, and they're kind of staggering around because they're super hungry. And the fat cows eat the skinny cows, right? And then you have some grain and great big heads of grain here growing in the field, and then you have some really skinny, scrawny ones, and the fat ones eat the scrawny ones, and I don't know what it means. And he can't find any of his advisors or wise men to tell him what the dream means. Finally, of course, you know what happens. The butler raises his hand and says, hey, there's a guy in jail that can do this kind of thing because he did it for me. So they bring Joseph in, they clean him up. Pharaoh says, here's the dream, and then you tell me what it means. So Pharaoh tells Joseph the dream, and Joseph interprets it. Nebuchadnezzar, whether you like him or not, you got to respect his insights and stuff. I believe that he suspects his advisors of being maybe phonies and frauds, and he says, look, if you are everything you say you are, and you have the insights and the connection to the supernatural that you say you do, here's the challenge, and here's how I'll know that you're telling me the truth. You tell me what my dream was, I'll know if you're correct, and then you tell me what it means. If you can't even tell me what my dream was, how in the world can you interpret it, right? And some people think, well, Nebuchadnezzar just forgot his dream. I kind of don't think so. If it bothered him enough to bring in all of his advisors to tell him what it means, it was urgent, he was desperate on his mind, I don't think he forgot what it was. I think he's absolutely weeding out the phonies here. And again, some writers have suggested that these are leftover advisors from his father, and he was kind of looking for a reason to gather in his own set of advisors. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I have no idea. It's really kind of irrelevant. But he puts these advisors to the test. And again, Nebuchadnezzar, you got to respect his insights and wisdom here. Frankly, I kind of wish more people were a little bit more skeptical of this kind of thing and put it to the test than what they do. But he says, tell me the interpretation, tell me the dream. Wise guys say, all right, you tell us what the dream is, and then we'll interpret it. Verse 6, if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. If you don't, of course, you are dead. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. And the wise guys all stand around. They're standing in a huddle in front of the king. They're looking at each other, saying, what do we do now? I mean, if he tells us the dream, we can kind of collaborate, say we're doing our little voodoo dance or whatever. Come back. We can agree on an interpretation, something that the king will like, something that will make him feel good, something that will make him like us. Pats on the back all the way around, and we'll go about our life, and it'll be all good. But we have a problem here. The king is not telling us what the dream is. What do we do? So they come back to him, verse 7. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. One more round, right? Again, they come back because they're hoping maybe the king has changed his mind. Maybe he was in a bad mood the first time. I don't know how much time has gone on between these two exchanges. Maybe it was instantaneous. Maybe it was a few days. I don't know. But they're hoping maybe we heard wrong. Maybe the king changed his mind. Whatever. So now he's going to tell us the dream, and we can come up with an explanation for what it means. The king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the times change. In other words, until my mood changes or I change my mind. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. And again, here's where we can see what's going on in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, right? He says, I know you guys are trying to trick me. I know you're trying to just collaborate, come up with some pretty story, make me feel good, and then you go on your way. And I'm not going to have it. I want to know what the real meaning of this dream is. And to show me that you can do that, you're going to tell me what the dream is, then you're going to interpret for me. If you can't even tell me what it is, I'm going to rip you limb from limb, destroy your house, turn it into a landfill, and find some new advisors. And the advisors say what? Oh boy, we've got a problem. So apparently they probably, and I'm kind of guessing here, but they probably disperse. They say, all right, give us a little time to figure this out. They all go to their homes and they have a panic attack. They do whatever kind of sorcery, black magic, arts, divinations, whatever they can try to do to conjure up some kind of idea what this dream is. And they have no idea. So the king has said, if you can't figure out what the problem is, you're all dead. The Chaldeans, verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king. They said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demands. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. And this just sets up the scenario perfectly for a guy named Daniel in a few verses. But look at what he says there. He said, no king has ever asked this of anybody, Nebuchadnezzar. What are you talking about? I think they realize at this point that he's not changing his mind. This isn't a whim on his point. Their lives are done if they can't figure it out. And they're saying, look, king, all pretenses aside here, nobody can do what you're asking to do. I mean, we're putting down the party hats and the costumes and stuff. We're just being honest with you here. Nobody can do this. Only the gods can do this. And they don't live here with us. I mean, they're not talking to us. Let's be honest. Again, all pretending aside, all costume, all pretense aside, only the gods can do this. And they don't dwell with people. Their dwelling is not with flesh. They don't talk to us. They don't communicate. Gods don't talk to people. It just doesn't work that way. At least they're being honest now at this point, right? And the king is probably understandably furious. He's mad. So, verse 12. Because the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. So apparently they go out and gather up all these guys who, again, I don't know if had gone home to try to conjure up anything they could, I don't know, whatever. But they went out to gather them up, to bring them together probably for the execution. Verse 15, he, Daniel, declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested to the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. It sounds here, since Daniel had to be filled in on the whole situation, that he wasn't really there at the first meeting. It sounds like he was off doing something else. The guard shows up and he says, "Whoa, what's going on? Tell me, catch me up here. Why am I being hauled off to be executed? I don't quite understand." Question, why was he not there the first time around? The king called all the advisors, everybody in to try to answer this vision. Why was Daniel not there? Maybe he hadn't graduated yet to be considered an advisor. Maybe he wasn't at the meeting because he was still back home in his dorm room, eating a piece of leftover rutabaga from last night's supper and studying for the next exam. And the guy comes knocking on the dorm room, "Hey, buddy, you're going to be considered one of these advisors too. I guess your head is gone as well." Daniel says, "Whoa, what happened here?" And he puts down his leftover rutabaga, puts down his exam, and says, "Maybe we better talk about this. What's going on?" And so the guy fills him in. Again, I'm speculating a little bit here, but I think it's pretty plain to see Daniel wasn't at the first meeting. So either he wasn't a senior enough member to be called in, or he wasn't even considered an advisor yet because he hadn't graduated. My personal opinion is probably the second. But you can take that for what you think it's worth. So Daniel gets filled in on what's going on, and he boldly says, "All right, let me set up an appointment to go talk to the king so I can give this interpretation to him." That's a pretty bold statement because he didn't have the interpretation yet. Verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to his three buddies, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. I'll bet they were sincere in their prayer at that point. They were pretty desperate. Verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belongs wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter." And it's clearly, blatantly obvious here what he's done. He's thanking, he's giving God all the credit for everything he's received. By the way, just to tie back to chapter 1, we said, why do we think that he might have done the thing with his dietary thing that he did? Well, I offered idols, maybe dietary laws, but again, what statement was he trying to make? Again, he's saying everything I am and everything I can do and will become is credited to who? To the God, to Yahweh, to the God of Israel, right? And now already in chapter 2, we're saying that he needs some of this guidance and insight from the God of Israel. Not from Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one needing the request. He's the one needing the information. So when the information needs to be had, Daniel goes to his God, and God delivers to him, and he gives thanks and recognition to God. So in verses 17 to 19, we see that Daniel depends on God. The first one he goes to when this comes up, straight to God. God gives the message. He immediately turns around and gives thanks to this God, to his God, the God of Israel. Then he turns around in verses 24 and 30 and says this, "Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, 'Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon.'" Apparently the execution had not yet taken place because he says, "Don't kill them." And by the way, Daniel was still alive too. "Don't destroy all these guys. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation." Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste and said to him, "I have found among the exiles of Judah." How does he classify Daniel? "I have found among one of your advisors." He doesn't say that really, does he? I don't know if this is significant or not, but he still classifies Daniel as simply one of the exiles of Judah. Again, making me think that maybe he wasn't graduated yet into the advisor role. I found among the exiles of Judah, in his dorm room, chewing on half a rutabaga from last night's supper, a man who will make known to the king his interpretation. And in walks this little kid. And all the elderly, austere advisors of the king, maybe they're standing around, maybe they're not, I don't know, but they all look at this little wet-behind-the-ears teenager kid stumbling into the king's presence. This little nobody of a kid. And the king declares to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation?" And Daniel says, "Gulp." Verse 27, Daniel answered the king and said, "No wise men, or enchanters, or magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days." Again, compare that to what the wise men had just told the king. "King, nobody can do this but the gods, and the gods don't talk to us people." And Daniel comes in and says, "I can't do it, but there is a God who has talked to me, and he's the one that can give you the answer you need. Not your gods, not the gods of those other guys. My God can do this for you." Verse 28, "Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living. I'm no smarter than anybody else. But in order that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind." King, God has given you this dream in order so that you will know what will happen in the future. I'm no smarter than anybody else. I can't tell you what the dream means. And I almost wonder there if he didn't pause for dramatic effect. I mean, he seems pretty confident and in charge at this point. And here's the king who's ready to rip apart anybody who can't do it. And he comes into the king's presence, and the king says, "Can you do it?" And Daniel says, "No, I can't." But, and it fills me out of pause just for dramatic effect like that. But there's a God who can, and this God came and told me what it is. And he did so that you'll know what's going on. So again, I don't think we can overstate this. Again, after he depended on God, after he gave thanks to God, now he comes into the king's presence, and he completely and totally gives credit to this God. Is that consistent with what we saw in chapter 1? Absolutely. Is that consistent with what we're going to see for the next several chapters? I think so. And as we go through the next several chapters over the next several weeks, keep this in mind. This is a recurring theme. Okay? Which brings us to verse 31. And here's where Daniel starts to actually disclose the dream to the king. He says, "King, you saw, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And as you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them to pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, all together were broken in pieces and became like chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. And now we will tell the king its interpretation." And again, I think it's almost interesting that the king said nothing at this point. I wonder what the king is doing right now. I think he's pretty amazed. He's probably sitting there in his throne like this. Out of all of his senior advisors, his wide guys who had been serving him and likely his father for decades, the smartest and the wisest of the kingdom, all could not come close to telling the king what his dream was. And here's this little pipsqueak of a guy, an exile, a refugee from Jerusalem. A little teenage kid stumbles in here, and he tells me exactly what I saw in my dream. How does he do it? Well, he already said how he did it, but I'm sure the king was amazed at this point. So much so that the king didn't even interrupt. He didn't even say, "Wow, that's amazing," or "Stop, how do I know you're telling the truth?" It was obvious to the king that Daniel knew what he was talking about, because he just relayed the pictures in his mind without the king having told him what it was. And he lets him continue. Verse 36, this was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. And the king probably smiles a little bit at that. He liked hearing that kind of thing. He likes being the head of gold. Yes, God, this God, whichever God you're serving, who can read and interpret dreams, who knows what visions went through my mind and knows what they mean, he gave them to me. He made me this king. I am this head of gold. And he gave me dominion over all these lands and made me in charge of it all. In fact, I find it fascinating in verse 38, in whom he has given wherever they dwell the children of man, that's all the people, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. And I wonder, what does that mean? Not only did God give him the ability to conquer the people, gave him dominion over the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens. And again, as I read through different commentators and stuff in this verse, it says, well, obviously speaking in hyperbole here, saying that Nebuchadnezzar, you're just going to dominate everybody and everything that you touch. Now, obviously not literally having mind control over the animals or anything, but he's given you great success. And I think, maybe, but even then I'm not so sure. And my mind went back to Jeremiah chapter 27, verse 6. We won't look it up unless you really want to, but even Jeremiah says, I give you, this guy Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to have command over the people and over the beasts of the field. And in Jeremiah chapter 28, verse 14, again, give you success and dominion over the people and over the beasts of the field. And here again in Daniel, give you dominion over the people and the beasts of the field. If that's just hyperbole and exaggeration to make a point, it seems weird to me that it was repeated across two different authors at two different locations and three different isolated passages. I wonder if there wasn't something more to that. Do you think, and again we're kind of speculating here, but based on what we see, do you think God gave him so much power in this life that he not only had military might to conquer the people, but he gave him some kind of special, almost rolled back the curse of Adam a little bit to where he had extra dominion over the animals and could command them to do things? Again, I can't prove one way or the other. You take from it what you want. But those are three different passages from two different authors written at two different locations that both say the exact same thing. If it's just figurative language, it's interesting that they'd use the same language. But if it's literal, this guy really did have a lot of power, all given to him by God to accomplish a purpose. And it's no wonder why he keeps getting a big head over and over if he really has that much power in one person. Just a side thought. But we'll continue. Verse 39, you are the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 39, another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all of these. And as you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with a soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever, just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hands, and that it broke to pieces the iron and the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. Here's a picture up on the screen of what the king saw. Again, roughly, this is an artist interpretation that I found on the internet somewhere. Here's what we know for sure, and people get wrapped up in the interpretation and the meaning of the different alloys and the different body parts and the statue, and we'll go through that quickly. I'm not going to get completely lost in the weeds of what means what in this lesson. And I hope that doesn't disappoint everyone, but I'm just not going to. We'll go through it a little bit more quickly. The head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar. That's Babylon. He gives us that right here in the passage. He assigns that meaning. The other thing we know is that the rock that comes hurling at this statue at the end of the story, at the end of the vision, that is the everlasting kingdom, not made of hands, sent by God to destroy all others. I think we can pretty certainly say that that is the Messianic kingdom that will someday come, right? Other than that, in this passage, Daniel doesn't really assign much meaning other than to say that these are all successive kingdoms that come. Later in his book, in a couple chapters, we will see that he talks in a similar, not a statue vision, but in other futuristic visions to come. He assigns the next coming kingdoms to the Medes and the Persians, which will overthrow the Babylonians. We know that from history, and also then the Greeks that come as well. Beyond that, the iron, most people believe, of a conservative nature anyway, that was Rome. I tend to agree with that as well. Very strong. It crushes everything it comes in contact with. That's just the way the Roman armies and the Roman Empire worked. And then for the feet, you have the feet of iron mixed with clay, an element of that same strength and brute force, and yet with a brittleness and a lack of cohesion somehow. Many people think that is, for right now, we'll call it the Roman-ish empire that probably is to come. Why do we think all that? Well, first of all, we have different metals of different qualities and different strengths. And again, how much do you read into visions and what is significant, what is not? Some people say the number of arms and legs is significant. Some people say it's not. Some people say, well, what do the different qualities and values of the alloys mean? Some people don't. I'll give you my best opinion, and again, you can halfway take it or leave it. Again, we do know for sure that the head of gold is Babylon, the mountain was Christ. That's given there. That's not questionable. Head of gold, the finest and most refined, the most elegant of the empires, highly organized, just a high quality, centered and focused on the king of Babylon, of Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, it says, you Nebuchadnezzar are the head of gold. In fact, it didn't even really say the Babylonian Empire. After Nebuchadnezzar died, leadership went downhill pretty quick after that. They had a lot of kind of flailings around with lesser emperors, and then, of course, they were overthrown by the Medes and the Persians. They were kind of a partnership kingdom where they kind of traded off power back and forth. That was the arms and chest of silver. Again, people say, aha, 2 arms, Medes, Persians, a dual kingdom. Maybe there's significance to that, but it never had kind of the illustrious nature that the empire of Babylon did. Following that is Greece. It came and overthrew the Medes and the Persians. Again, it had one great leader, military leader, of course, Alexander the Great. And after that, it also deteriorated pretty quick after his generals started bickering about who would be in charge, and kind of the south and the north and the south kind of ended up emerging and fighting, and Daniel talks about that later. We won't get into that right now again. Following that, Rome. Again, Rome, less of a refined value, but super strong and super brutal, which reflected the way Rome did things. Then we get to the bottom of the feet, partly iron and partly not iron, partly clay. Again, commentators tell me, and I'll be honest, I'm not quite exactly sure what was in mind. In verse 42 it says, the end of verse 41, just as you saw iron mixed with soft clay. So in the verse, it makes it sound like this, the soft Play-Doh-y clay that you sculpt in art class or whatever. Commentators say, no, the word is actually a baked brittle china. Well, if the word says baked brittle china and the scripture here says soft clay, which do you go with? Obviously, the scripture says what it says. But regardless, it doesn't matter if it's hard or soft. Either way, it's weak and it doesn't adhere well to the metal. And so it tries to be strong. It tries to mix different components, which doesn't work well. It destabilizes the government or the structure, whatever that would be. And it falls apart and ultimately disintegrates fairly quickly. Many people think this is the empire that is yet to come, which would be future to us, right? So the first 4, the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron. Those are, to us, are all past. And then possibly the feet. Then there's a time gap, some people think, and the feet mixed with the clay are the future kingdom yet to come, probably the Antichrist. I think that's probably correct, would be my guess. And the reason I say that is because the stone, the ultimate kingdom, the Messiah, when he comes, he strikes which portion? He strikes specifically the feet. And then when he strikes the feet, everything else comes down with it, meaning all the influence of all the past empires comes crumbling and goes away. Because in the past, usually what happens is the succeeding empire takes the best of the ideas from the preceding empire, adopts it into itself, tries to improve it, and then the next one does that too. They overthrow the previous empire, but they keep a lot of the elements of it, try to recycle it into their own empire, and so they absorb a lot of what has gone on before. The stone, the ultimate kingdom, not cut out by human hands, he doesn't absorb anything from the previous kingdoms. He sets up his own kingdom. It will always last. It will never deteriorate. It never goes away. And it strikes on the feet of iron and clay. Well, the Messianic kingdom hasn't come yet. And if it has to strike specifically on this organization, this government, the iron and the clay organization, and it hasn't come yet, then it has to be future to us. And so once it strikes that, all the other philosophies and the pagan ideas and the cultures that have come before are gone, and he sets up his very own kingdom, which will remain forever, and it will never go away. Not cut out by human hands, not set up by some ordinary mortal person that wants to be king. This is set up by a superhuman, a non-human entity, which we know, well, he was human, but not just strictly human. The Christ, the Messiah who comes. The last verse, verse 45. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. This dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. And again, I think it's just interesting why he threw that last phrase in there. I don't know if he said that just to let Nebuchadnezzar know that, yes, this is the way it's going to be and it's going to happen, or if he's actually kind of echoing back to Nebuchadnezzar his own phrase. Remember what Nebuchadnezzar said about his vision and his determination that everybody interpret the dream for him? This has gone out from me. This is sure. This is how it will be. You will tell me my dream and interpret it. I will not change my mind. This is final. And Daniel comes and he gives the interpretation and he gives the dream. And he gets to the end of the dream and he says, based on God's authority, this is the interpretation and it is final. Before, Nebuchadnezzar is being the tough king giving the orders. Now who's the tough king giving the orders? It's God. And who's the recipient and who is taking the orders at this point? The great king Nebuchadnezzar. And all of a sudden the tables have changed and we see who's really in charge. Yeah. Verse 46. Then Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered to him. And the king answered and said to Daniel, get this, truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. By the way, how do you think that went over with all the senior members of his advisory committee? By the way, 55, 60, 65-year-old advisor who served under us for decades, here's your new boss. He is a 17-year-old kid who is not quite graduated yet, but he will in the spring, and now he's your boss because I'm setting him in charge over you. And I think maybe where we can see maybe some of the tension and strife and jealousy between the advisors, and they try to throw Daniel in the lion's den and stuff like that later on. Of course, that happens much later in his life, but it makes you wonder what kind of politics were going on there. Side note. Verse 49, Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained in the king's court. But the king is so impressed by the interpretation and the wisdom that Daniel, and more specifically his God, has shown. He says this, I can't believe it. Daniel, pipsqueak, student, kid, your God, he is the greatest. I can't believe no God has ever done this. Your God is super amazing. Your God is the God of gods. He's the Lord of kings. He's the revealer of mysteries. And Nebuchadnezzar turns his back, for a moment anyway, on all of his Babylonian gods, the whole slew of them, and he looks at Daniel and his God and says, "You are the real one. You are the real thing." Nobody else could consult Nebo or Marduk or any of my other gods. They weren't answering. They weren't picking up the phone on this one. Your God pulled through, and he did it. Your God is able to reveal this mystery. And I think maybe that the point of this whole story, the point of chapter 2, isn't necessarily in the interpretation of the dream. I mean, we like to get into that and see how the prophecies play out and how the future's predicted and what is to come and all that. And that's fine. That's all valid. But is that why chapter 2 is here? I wonder if chapter 2 isn't here because of what we see in verses 46 through the end of the chapter, where Nebuchadnezzar, the great and grand king, is confronted by the God. And what started out as great King Nebuchadnezzar is now taking orders from the great God, and he's praising the God as the true power of the universe, who sets up kings and who takes them down, just like Daniel said in his prayer. You reveal mysteries. You put people up. You take them down. You decide what happens when, and you call the shots. And this God who supposedly lived in Jerusalem of the exiles, now we're clear over here in Babylon, and he's taking charge of the greatest empire on earth. We saw this slide earlier on when Daniel was making his prayer, how Daniel depended on God. Verses 20 to 23, he gave thanks to God. Verse 24 to 30, he gives credit to God. Now we have one more passage to add to that. God gets the credit and honor even from Nebuchadnezzar. And in his first real confrontation with God, it's God score 1, Nebuchadnezzar score 0, because God has proven himself to be in charge even over Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar himself openly acknowledges this. Now, we said this portion is in Aramaic. It's speaking to the entire Babylonian kingdom. You are Joe Q. Babylonian walking the streets of Babylon, and you hear this story. What's your impression? What do you think as you hear this story? Your great emperor, possibly even deified himself, supposedly in the eyes of people. He consults all of his own Babylonian gods, the gods that you yourself have worshipped all your life. They failed. Then another god from, where was it again? Jerusalem, that's right, Judea, something like that, way over, one of the exiles. One of their gods pulled through and did what the king asked, which was a completely irresponsible and impossible task, and this God did it. What's your impression? What do you think? What's your response to that story? What do you think? Hello, we have a new God in town. And he's the real thing. This God of the Jews, I don't know who this God is, but he is something else. Maybe I should be paying attention to him, right?